Friend the archive of necessary darkness. They called me the Emperor's accountant. Not officially, of course. The administratum has no room for nicknames in its organizational charts. But my colleagues used it when they thought I couldn't hear. Whispered behind hands as I passed between the record stacks with another crate of execution. Summaries balanced against my hip. I took pride in it. For 16 years I had served as senior ledger keeper, 3rd class, in the Ordo Hereticus Archive Subsection on Scintilla, and my duty was sacred. I maintained the complete record of every heretic purged within the Calixis Sector. Cross-referenced their crimes against doctrinal indices, verified that justice had been properly executed and properly documented. Every death I catalogued proved the Emperor's will was absolute. Every execution I filed was another soul saved from corruption's spread. My supervisor, archivist, Primaris Velen, told me my faith made my work flawless. I believed her. I believed all of it. My name is Matthias Kael, and I want you to understand something before I tell you what I discovered. I was complicit long before I became a victim. The archive occupied sub-level 17 of the Tricorn Palace, beneath the inquisitorial chambers where sentences were pronounced and above the interrogation cells, where confessions were extracted. We existed in between, the paper membrane separating judgment from punishment. The air was kept at precisely 14 degrees Celsius, cold enough to preserve parchment and prevent mold, cold enough that I wore my wool vestment, even in the middle of summer's heat 30 levels above. The scent was particular dust and ink, sanctified parchment, and the faint chemical bite of preservation unguents. I can still smell it when I close my eyes. I spent my days breathing the preserved memory of death. My routine was sacred in its precision. I arrived each morning exactly 4 minutes into the 8th hour when the second bell rang from the chapel of the sainted martyr. I would hang my overcoat on peg 7, 3rd row from the entrance, and proceed to Station 4, where my ledgers waited in their locked cabinet. The key hung from my rosary. Blessed by Confessor Thrake himself when I received my promotion to 3rd class. I would kiss the Aquila pendant, unlock the cabinet, and begin my day's work with a prayer of purpose. Emperor, guide my hand that I may serve your justice. Emperor, steady my eye that I may record your truth. Emperor, harden my heart that I may not falter before necessary horror. The work itself followed established patterns. Execution records arrived from across the sector in sealed cylinders, stamped with the inquisitorial seal and marked with priority codes. Red cylinders meant high priority cases requiring immediate processing. Black cylinders meant standard heresy executions. White cylinders, rarely seen, contained special circumstances requiring careful documentation. I would unseal each cylinder, remove the parchment within, and begin verification. First, I confirmed the Inquisitor's signature matched the authorization matrix. Second, I verified the date of execution against the date of judgment. Third, I cross-referenced the heretical charges against the indices hereticus to ensure proper doctrinal classification. Fourth, I logged the case number, name of the condemned, location of execution, and method employed. Fifth, I filed the original document in the appropriate section of the archive while transcribing summary data into the master ledgers. 17,640, 3 cases I had processed when everything began to unravel. I remember that number because I kept count, took pride in each one. 17,000 proofs that the Imperium's vigilance was eternal. 17,000 confirmations of my purpose. My station was in the northeastern corner of the archive floor, beneath a lumen strip that hummed with a pitch that matched the frequency of the ventilation system. Other ledger keepers worked at their own stations, heads bent over their own documents, all of us maintaining the great record in sacred silence. We rarely spoke during work hours. Speech invited error, and error in documentation was itself a form of heresy. The Emperor's justice must be perfectly preserved. To misfile a case number, to transpose a date, to misspell a name, was to corrupt the historical record of his divine judgment. I took my midday meal in the Administratum Refectory on level 19, always at the same table near the western wall, where the noise from the Vox speakers was quietest. Protein paste, grain ration, recaf so bitter it made my teeth ache. The same meal every day for 16 years. Consistency was its own form of devotion. I would eat in silence, review my morning's work in my mind, plan the afternoon's tasks. Then back to Station 4, back to the ledgers, back to the sacred duty of recording death. The archive held 217 years of accumulated records. The oldest documents, from shortly after the Angevin Crusade, were kept in environmentally sealed vaults behind plasteel doors that required 3 separate authorization codes to open. The newest arrivals sat in processing bins, waiting for ledger keepers like myself to give them permanence. Between these extremes stretched row after row of filing cabinets, each drawer labeled with date ranges and heresy classifications. Walking those rows felt like walking through a cemetery made of paper. Each drawer contained hundreds of deaths. Each cabinet held thousands. The archive as a whole preserved the memory of millions condemned for the crime of deviation. I found peace in the work. That's important for you to understand. This wasn't simply employment. It was vocation. Every file I processed was another soul whose corruption had been cleansed, another potential outbreak prevented, another thread of heresy cut before it could weave itself into the fabric of imperial culture. The priests taught us that humanity stood perpetually 3 seconds from midnight, that only constant vigilance prevented our extinction, that mercy toward the corrupt was cruelty toward the faithful. I believed it. When I filed execution records for entire families purged because one member had shown signs of mutation, I saw it as tragedy made necessary by circumstance. When I documented the burning of scholars who had questioned historical orthodoxy, I understood it as intellectual hygiene. When I catalogued the deaths of children too young to speak their own names, I told myself their innocence made them especially vulnerable to chaos, that euthanasia was mercy. I told myself this for 16 years. My first real conversation with archivist Primaris Velen came during my 3rd year of service. I had discovered a discrepancy in case file 4471. Theta, the execution date, preceded the investigation completion date by 5 days. I brought it to her attention, expecting praise for my diligence, assuming this was a simple clerical error that I had caught before it corrupted the permanent record. She looked at the file for a long moment, her augmetic eye clicking and wearing as its focus adjusted. Then she smiled at me with what I thought was approval. "This is not an error, Matthias," she said, her voice carrying the same careful precision she used when explaining archival procedure. The investigation confirmed what was already known through other means. The execution was scheduled for administrative convenience. Sometimes justice moves faster than bureaucracy. The Emperor's will is not constrained by our paperwork timelines. I accepted this explanation. I filed the document. I moved on to the next case. I should have questioned it then, but faith is a shield against inconvenient questions, and I wore mine without gaps. The archive had its rhythms, its seasonal patterns of work. Spring and autumn brought increased processing loads as inquisitorial purges intensified during campaign seasons. Winter was quieter, fewer executions to document as ships were grounded by warp storms. Summer was variable. We measured time not by months but by execution rates, not by festivals but by purge cycles. I knew that every 3 years, like clockwork, The number of heresy cases would spike dramatically for approximately 6 weeks, then return to baseline levels. The senior archivists called it the correction period, and they explained it as natural fluctuation in detection rates. Vigilance uncovered hidden corruption, they said. The cycles proved our methods worked. I never questioned why the cycles were so precise. I never asked why corruption would reveal itself according to schedule. My personal life was minimal. I maintained a small efficiency habitation on level 40. 3 rooms and a fresher unit, which I rarely saw in daylight. I attended weekly devotion at the Chapel of the Sainted Martyr, where I would kneel for exactly 40 minutes and recite the Litany of Duty 7 times. I had no family. My parents had given me to the Schola Progenium when I was 6, after my father died serving in the Astra Militarum. The Schola trained me for administrative service, taught me that precision was holiness, that order was next to divinity, that the Imperium's survival depended on people willing to make themselves small parts of a vast machine. I was a perfect small part. My gears meshed cleanly with the gears around me. I turned when required, in the direction specified, at the speed prescribed. I took pride in my mechanical perfection. On the 73rd day of the year's 11th month, I processed case file 8834, Omega. It was a white cylinder, special circumstances, which meant I needed to read it with extra care. The file documented the purge of Hive Secundus on the world of Malfi, population 73 million souls. The charge was systemic corruption with high probability of chaotic taint. The investigation report ran to 417 pages. I read every word, as procedure demanded. The investigation had been thorough. Inquisitor Valdane had spent 8 months on Malfi, had questioned 14,000 citizens, had employed gene sampling across 20% of the population, had conducted theological examinations of the planetary priesthood. His conclusion, buried on page 394 in a section marked Final Assessment, was clear and unambiguous. No evidence of genuine chaos corruption detected. Population demonstrates orthodox faith and imperial loyalty. Doctrinal compliance within acceptable parameters. Recommend no action beyond standard monitoring. I read it 3 times to be certain I understood correctly. Then I turned to the execution summary. Hive Secundus had been destroyed by orbital bombardment 6 weeks after the investigation concluded. 73 million souls reduced to radioactive ash. The authorization bore Inquisitor Valdane's signature, the same man who had found no corruption. The justification field, which should have contained detailed explanation of why the recommendation changed, contained a single word: necessary. I sat at my station for 20 minutes without moving. The lumen strip hummed above me. Around me, other ledger keepers processed their own files, their quills scratching against parchment in steady rhythm. My hands had gone cold despite the vestment I wore. I told myself there must be an explanation. Perhaps new evidence had emerged after page 394. Perhaps there were classified annexes I lacked clearance to see. Perhaps necessary was administrative shorthand for complex reasoning that didn't need full documentation in the summary records. I filed the case. I moved to the next cylinder. But that night, lying in my habitation with the recycled air whispering through the vents, I couldn't sleep. 73 million people. No evidence of genuine chaos corruption detected. Necessary. The next morning I arrived at my station 4 minutes into the 8th hour as always, but my hands shook slightly as I unlocked the cabinet. I decided I would process the day's assignments and think no more about case file 8834, Omega. It was not my place to question inquisitorial judgment. I was a ledger keeper. I recorded. I did not interpret. But faith, once cracked, admits doubt through the fissures. 3 days later I processed case file 8891 Theta, a manufacturer on Sanofi, producing standard pattern lasgun power cells. The workers, approximately 8,000 souls, had been purged for suspected mutation with probable heretical origin. The genetic screening results, attached as Annex 7, showed negative for all mutation markers across the entire workforce. Negative, not inconclusive. Not trace readings requiring further examination. Negative. I turned to the execution authorization. At the bottom, in a section I had never paid attention to before, because it seemed merely administrative, was a production note. Productivity ratings below sector quota for 3 consecutive quarters. Population, replacement more cost, effective than retraining program. Mutation charges provide legal framework for efficient resolution. 8,000 people. Murdered for missing productivity targets. I stood from my station so quickly that my chair fell backward, clattering against the floor. The noise echoed through the archive. Every other ledger keeper looked up from their work, surprised by the disruption. Archivist, Primaris Velen emerged from her office, her augmetic eye rotating to focus on me. Matthias, are you unwell? I picked up my chair. My face felt hot despite the archive's carefully maintained cold. Forgive me, Archivist, Primaris. A moment of clumsiness. It will not happen again. She studied me for a long moment, her human eye showing something I couldn't quite read. Then she nodded and returned to her office. The other ledger keepers returned to their work. I sat down and forced my breathing to steady. I filed case file 8891, Theta, in its proper location. I processed the remaining cases in my assignment queue. I completed my workday with mechanical precision. That evening I did not go home. I told the duty monitor I needed to complete quality verification on previous filings, which was permitted for senior ledger keepers in good standing. After the day shift departed, and only the night skeleton crew remained, I went to the deep archives. I pulled cases at random, looking for pattern. Looking for proof that I was wrong, that case file 8834 Omega and case file 8891 Theta were anomalies, aberrations, exceptions that proved the rule. I found 73 cases in 4 hours of searching. 73 files where the investigation report recommended no action and the execution happened anyway. 73 files where the justification was economics or politics or administrative convenience rather than actual heresy. 73 proofs that what I had discovered was not exception but pattern. I sat on the floor of Archive Row 17, surrounded by scattered files, my vestment covered in dust, and I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Perhaps the investigators were incompetent. Perhaps they missed subtle signs of corruption that wiser authorities caught later. Perhaps my interpretation of the documents was flawed, lacking context that would make everything clear. Perhaps this was a test of my faith, a trial to see if I would hold to doctrine, even when confronted with apparent contradiction. I gathered the files. I returned them to their proper locations. I went home as the first bell of morning rang. I did not sleep. The next day I processed 17 cases without incident. Standard heresy, standard investigation, standard execution. Everything documented properly, everything justified appropriately. See, I told myself. Those other cases were unusual. Most of the work is legitimate. Most of the deaths are necessary. But doubt, once admitted, does not politely leave when asked. I began to notice things I had overlooked for 16 years. The way execution warrants were sometimes pre-dated, printed and signed before investigations even began. The way certain charges, administrative heresy, and doctrinal non-compliance, appeared most frequently during the correction periods every 3 years. The way justification fields increasingly contained phrases like necessary, required, expedient, rather than detailed theological reasoning. The way some files contained no investigation reports at all, just execution confirmations and a case number. I started keeping count. Not in the official ledgers where my notations would be seen, but in my private devotional journal, where I normally recorded prayers. I marked cases where evidence contradicted judgment, cases where investigations recommended mercy and executions proceeded regardless, cases where entire populations died for administrative convenience or political expediency or reasons not stated at all. By the end of the second month of my private documentation, I had catalogued 217 cases. By the end of the fourth month, 539. The numbers grew steadily as I reviewed older archives, checking files from years past with new eyes that saw what faith had previously hidden. 17,640, 3 cases I had processed in my career. How many had been like case file 8834, Omega? How many innocent souls had I helped consign to death with my careful filing, my meticulous record keeping, my faithful service? I began to make mistakes at my station. Small errors at first. Transposed numbers in case file identifiers. Dates written in incorrect format. Names misspelled in the master ledgers. Archivist Primaris Velen called me to her office after I filed a red priority case in the wrong cabinet entirely. Matthias, you have served with distinction for 16 years, she said, her augmetic eye clicking as it studied my face. Your work has been flawless. These recent errors concern me. Is something troubling you? I almost told her. I almost laid out what I had discovered, thinking she would be equally horrified. That together we would report this corruption to higher authority, that the system would correct itself once the truth was known. But something in her expression stopped me. A wariness around her human eye. A resignation in the set of her shoulders. She already knew. I realized. She had processed the same files I had seen the same patterns, and had chosen to continue anyway. I have been unwell, I said instead. A respiratory infection. It affects my concentration. I will be more careful. She nodded, but her human eye held mine for a moment longer than necessary. Faith is a shield, Matthias. When doubt enters, corruption follows. Hold to your duty. It will anchor you. I returned to my station. I processed the day's assignments. But that night I did not go home. I returned to the deep archives, and this time I looked for something specific. The correction period. The 3-year cycle of intensified purges. I pulled every case file from the last correction period, 7 months prior. I stacked them on a reading table and began to document. 4,712 executions in 6 weeks. I read every file. I cataloged every charge. I cross-referenced every investigation report against every execution authorization. 3,960. 3 cases contained either no investigation report, insufficient evidence for heresy charges, or investigation reports explicitly recommending against execution. 84%. 84% of the correction period executions were not responses to actual heresy. They were quota fulfillment. They were administrative housekeeping. They were population management disguised as theological necessity. I found the pattern in the economic data attached to several files. Worlds that received clemency were productive, strategically valuable, politically connected. Worlds that were purged were economically marginal, politically isolated, administratively inconvenient. The Imperium was not purging heresy during correction periods. It was optimizing resource allocation. It was pruning unprofitable branches. It was conducting scheduled culling of populations that cost more to maintain than they produced. 4,712 souls murdered for efficiency. I sat in the archive until morning, surrounded by the paper graves of the innocent dead. The lumen strips hummed their eternal note. The ventilation whispered, The temperature held steady at 14 degrees Celsius, perfect for preserving documents, perfect for maintaining the record of systemic murder. When the day shift began to arrive, I was still sitting at the reading table. Archivist Primaris Velen found me there, the case files stacked around me in careful chronological order. "I see you have been conducting research," she said quietly. "I have been verifying patterns," I replied. My voice sounded distant to my own ears, as if someone else was speaking through my mouth. She sat across from me, her augmetic eye scanning the files I had pulled. "And what patterns have you found?" Correction periods are not responses to heretical outbreaks. They are scheduled purges of economically marginal populations. The 3-year cycle corresponds to fiscal review periods. We murder thousands to balance budgets. Velen was silent for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and gathered the files, restacking them with the same careful precision I had been taught to employ. "You understand that what you have discovered is classified at the highest level of inquisitorial authority. I understand that I have spent 16 years documenting mass murder. You have spent 16 years maintaining the records that prove the Imperium's justice is absolute," she corrected. "The purpose of those deaths may be more complex than you were initially led to believe, but the outcome is the same. Order is maintained. Stability is preserved. Humanity survives another year." I stared at her. 73 million souls on Malfi. No evidence of corruption. "You think their deaths preserved stability?" "I think that Malfi was consuming resources beyond its productive value, that its tithe contribution had declined for 17 consecutive years, that supporting it required drawing ships and supplies from sectors where they were more critically needed. I think that allowing unprofitable worlds to persist sends a message that failure carries no consequence. I think that hard choices must be made by someone, and better they be made by those who understand the stakes." Her human eye met mine, and I saw something I had never seen there before: exhaustion deeper than physical tiredness, older than her apparent age. "You think I don't question this, Matthias? You think I sleep well? I think you file the records and collect your pay and tell yourself that following orders absolves you of responsibility for what those orders contain." Velen stood. Her hands, I noticed for the first time, trembled slightly as she gathered the case files. "Return these to their proper locations. Process today's assignments. Go home tonight and think carefully about what you intend to do with what you have learned. Tomorrow we will speak again." She left me alone in the reading room. I returned the files. I processed the day's assignments with mechanical precision, every motion automatic, my mind elsewhere. When my shift ended, I returned to my habitation and sat on my cot in the dark, listening to the hab blocks ambient sounds, voices through thin walls, footsteps in corridors, the perpetual hum of recycling systems. I thought about Malfi. 73 million people who woke one morning and went about their ordinary lives, who worked in their manufactorums and tended their gardens and kissed their children, who had no idea that economic calculation had sentenced them to death, who burned when the bombardment came, who died knowing they had committed no crime, who perished for the sin of insufficient productivity. I thought about the manufactorum workers on Sonofia, 8,000 souls labeled mutants to provide legal framework for efficient resolution of a labor shortage. How many had families? How many had children? How many went to their executions still believing in the Imperium's justice, certain that some mistake would be corrected, that truth would save them? I thought about the 4,712 deaths from the last correction period. The deaths I had filed. The deaths I had documented with my careful handwriting and my meticulous cross-referencing, and my faithful service. The next morning I arrived at the archive 4 minutes into the 8th hour. I hung my overcoat on peg 7. I proceeded to station 4. I unlocked my ledger cabinet, and instead of beginning the day's processing, I went to Velen's office. She was waiting for me. On her desk sat a single file, my personnel record. "Sit," she said. I sat. "You have a choice to make, Matthias. I am going to explain something to you, and then you will decide how to proceed." She opened my personnel record, though she didn't look at it. The Imperium spans 1,000,000 worlds. At any given moment, approximately 30% of those worlds are failing to meet their tithe obligations. Another 20% are consuming more resources than they produce. 10% face active rebellion or heretical outbreak. This is constant. This is the baseline state of imperial governance. Then the Imperium is failing, I said. The Imperium is succeeding, she corrected. It is succeeding because we make hard choices. We cannot support every world. We cannot save every population. We must triage. We must cut away failing tissue before it spreads infection. The correction periods are not corruption of our purpose. They are implementation of our purpose. They are the scalpel that keeps the body alive. Be murdering millions of innocents. Be sacrificing marginal populations to preserve core functionality. Yes! She finally looked at my personnel record, her augmetic eye scanning data I couldn't see. You were Schola trained. You understand chain of command. You understand that someone must make these decisions, and better they be made by institutions that can maintain objectivity rather than leaving them to individuals who would let emotion compromise necessity. Objectivity. I repeated. The word tasted like ash. Is that what we call it when we fabricate heresy charges to justify economic murder? We call it survival, Velen said. We call it the continuation of human civilization in a galaxy that wants us extinct. You have read the files, Matthias. You know what happens to worlds left to their own devices. Chaos comes. Xenos come. Disaster comes. The Imperium is cruel, but it is cruel in service of a purpose. Without that cruelty, without that vigilance, without those hard choices, humanity would have burned 10,000 years ago. She stood, moved to the window that overlooked the Tricorn's inner plaza. I have supervised this archive for 41 years. I have processed approximately 300,000 execution records. I have seen the patterns you discovered. I questioned them, as you are questioning them now. I was given the same explanation I am giving you, and I made a choice, to be complicit, to be realistic. She turned back to me. What alternative do you propose? Should we spare every world that claims innocence? Should we conduct decade-long investigations into every accusation, while heresy spreads unchecked? Should we trust that individual judgment will consistently identify genuine threats when we know that humans are fallible, corruptible, prone to mercy that kills whole sectors? I propose we not murder people for missing productivity quotas. Then millions die differently, she said, and her voice carried absolute certainty. Millions die when resources are wasted on worlds that cannot sustain themselves. Millions die when we lack the ships to respond to actual threats, because those ships are occupied maintaining unprofitable territories. Millions die when the example of consequence is removed and disorder spreads. You want moral clarity, Matthias. You want a universe where the righteous are saved and only the guilty perish. That universe does not exist. We live in the universe where every choice kills someone, and the only question is whether we make those choices deliberately or stumble into them blind. I sat in silence, absorbing the full weight of what she was telling me. This was not corruption. This was not the system failing. This was the system functioning exactly as designed. The Imperium did not accidentally kill innocents. It killed them on purpose. It killed them according to carefully calculated formulas. It killed them efficiently, with proper documentation, with legal frameworks that transformed murder into administration. I have reviewed your personnel record. Velen continued. You are diligent, precise, faithful. You have the qualities we need in positions of higher authority. This crisis of conscience you are experiencing is not unusual. Most senior archivists undergo similar revelation eventually. Some adapt, some do not. She returned to her desk, placed her hands flat on its surface. Those hands were shaking, I noticed. Not much, but enough to see. If you adapt, if you accept the necessity of what we do, and continue your service with full knowledge of its purpose, you will be promoted. Within 5 years you will likely reach second class, possibly first. You will become part of the administrative apparatus that makes these decisions rather than simply recording them. You will have influence, within limits, to shape how and when these cullings occur. And if I do not adapt, then you will be disappeared, she said simply. Not because you know too much, though that is factor, but because you will have demonstrated that you lack the moral flexibility required for imperial service at this level. The Imperium cannot afford servants who place individual conscience above systematic necessity. You will be quietly transferred. Your memory will be wiped, or you will suffer an accident, and your position will be filled by someone more tractable. She pulled a data slate from her desk drawer, activated it, slid it across to me. This is The Necessity of Darkness. It is an inquisitorial treatise written 4,000 years ago by Lord Inquisitor Varinus. It is the philosophical foundation for everything you have discovered. Read it, understand it, then make your choice. I took the data slate. The screen showed a title page, The Necessity of Darkness, a meditation on fear, governance, and survival. Beneath it, a quote, "Cruelty is not the corruption of mercy. Cruelty is mercy that has learned to think in centuries rather than moments." I will think on this, I said. You have 3 days, Velen replied. After that, I need your decision. Will you adapt or will you refuse? Choose carefully, Matthias. Conscience is a luxury the Imperium cannot afford, but death is wasteful. I would prefer to keep you. I returned to my station. I processed the day's assignments. That night I read The Necessity of Darkness from first page to last. Lord Inquisitor Varinus had written with eloquence and clarity. His central thesis was simple. Humanity's survival required not merely defense against external threats, but carefully calibrated violence against itself. Populations allowed to live without fear drifted toward independence, questioned authority, developed regional identities that weakened imperial cohesion. Regular culling of innocent populations, disguised as anti-heresy operations, served multiple purposes. It maintained fear that prevented rebellion. It eliminated economically marginal populations before they could become actual heretical outbreaks. It demonstrated to productive worlds the cost of failure. It trained inquisitorial forces in purge operations during peacetime. It cycled through aged or inefficient populations, making room for fresh settlement. It was, Varinus argued, the dark foundation upon which the Imperium was built. Remove it, and the entire structure would collapse within a generation. He was not cruel in his writing. He was not gleeful. He wrote with the same exhausted resignation I had seen in Velen's eyes. He acknowledged the horror of what he was describing. He questioned it himself, devoted 17 pages to counterarguments and moral objections. And then he concluded, with mathematical precision, that every alternative produced worse outcomes. That mercy at the individual level was cruelty at the civilizational level. That someone must be willing to bear the burden of these choices, and better it be those who understood the weight rather than those who would make killing easier by dehumanizing victims. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, looking for the flaw in his reasoning, the place where the logic broke down. I could not find it. His argument was coherent, internally consistent, grounded in historical evidence drawn from the Age of Strife and the Great Crusade. He might be wrong about the necessity of these horrors, but he was not wrong about the costs of alternatives he described. That was the moment I understood. The true horror was not that the Imperium was corrupt. The true horror was that it might be exactly what it claimed to be, the least worst option. That this systematic murder might genuinely be necessary. That all my disgust, all my moral clarity, all my certainty that innocent deaths were unacceptable might be the luxury of someone who had never been responsible for choosing between types of catastrophe. I sat in my habitation through the night, turning this realization over in my mind. Could Varinus be right? Could Velen be right? Could systematic murder of innocents genuinely be required to prevent something worse? And if it was, did that make it acceptable? Did necessity override morality? Did scale trump individual rights? If killing one innocent person to save 10 was justified, was killing 10 million to save 100 million equally justified? Where was the line? Was there a line? I thought about Malfi again. 73 million souls. No evidence of corruption. But consuming resources beyond their productive value. Supporting them meant fewer ships, fewer supplies, less capability to respond to actual threats elsewhere. How many millions might die in some other sector because the Imperium wasted resources maintaining Malfi? That was Varinus's argument. That was the calculus of necessity. But they were people. They were 73 million individual human beings, each with their own thoughts and hopes and loves and fears. They were not statistics in a resource allocation formula. They were real, and yet, so were the hypothetical victims in other sectors who might die because resources went to Malfi instead of to them. Were those deaths more acceptable because they were potential rather than actual? Was there a moral difference between killing through action and killing through inaction? I did not sleep. By the time the first bell rang, I had not reached any conclusions except one. I could not serve this system with full knowledge of its nature. I could not file another execution record, knowing that it might be murder disguised as justice. I could not be complicit in systematic evil, even if that evil was argued to be necessary evil. Which left the question, what would I do instead? I went to the archive that morning, but I did not go to my station. I went to the deep vaults, to the oldest records, the ones that required 3 authorization codes to access. I used Velen's codes, which I had observed her entering hundreds of times over 16 years. The vault opened. I went inside. The oldest files were written on actual paper rather than parchment, preserved in stasis fields that made the air shimmer and taste of ozone. I pulled the earliest correction period I could find, 889. M39. Over a millennium passed. I read the files. The pattern was already there. The same bureaucratic murder. The same fabricated charges. The same economic rationalization barely hidden beneath theological language. This had been happening for over 1,000 years, probably longer, probably since the Imperium's founding. This was not aberration. This was design. This was the fundamental nature of the system I had served for 16 years. I pulled more files. I documented everything. I copied case numbers, dates, death counts. I transcribed the economic justifications and the fabricated charges. I built a record of the record, evidence of systematic murder spanning centuries. And as I worked, I had no illusions about what I was doing. This documentation would not reform the Imperium. It would not stop the correction periods. It would not save a single life. The Imperium was too vast, too old, too deeply committed to its dark foundations. Revealing this truth would change nothing except ending my own life. But I would not die ignorant. I would not die complicit. I would die knowing, and I would leave evidence for whoever might discover it, so that at least one person in the Imperium's future might know that someone had seen this horror and refused to accept it as necessary. I worked in the vault for 18 hours. When I finally emerged, Archivist Primaris Velen was waiting outside. "I wondered if you would come here," she said quietly. Her augmetic eye scanned the documentation I carried. "You are compiling evidence. I am creating a record of what the Imperium truly is. To what purpose? Who will you show it to? The Inquisition. They wrote the policies you are documenting. The Administratum. They implement them. The common citizens. They lack clearance to access these archives, and even if they could read what you have found, what would change? The Imperium would continue, because the Imperium must continue." She stepped closer, and I saw that her human eye was wet. Not crying, but close. "You are destroying yourself for nothing, Matthias. You are throwing away your life to create a document that will be filed and forgotten. Please, accept the necessity. Adapt. Survive. I cannot." "Then you are a fool," she said, but her voice broke on the word. "A righteous, moral, principled fool who will be dead by this time tomorrow. Better dead than what you have become." She struck me then, her hand moving so fast I did not see it coming. My head snapped sideways and I tasted blood. When I looked back at her, her human eye was streaming tears. "You think I do not hate myself," she whispered. "You think I do not lie awake every night, reviewing the files, seeing their faces, imagining their last moments. You think this is easy. You think adaptation is the same as acceptance." She grabbed my vestment, pulled me close. "I am dying inside, Matthias. Every day, a little more of who I was dies. But I continue because someone must maintain the record. Someone must witness. Someone must preserve the documentation of what we do, so that when the Imperium finally falls, when humanity finally ends, there will at least be a record that we knew, that we understood what we were, that we were not ignorant monsters, but conscious ones who chose horror with open eyes." She released me, stepped back, wiped her face with trembling hands. "You have until morning. Use the time well." I spent that night in my habitation, writing this account. Not in the formal language of archive documentation, but in plain speech that anyone might understand. I wrote about my 16 years of faithful service. I wrote about case file 8834, Omega and Malfi's 73 million dead. I wrote about the correction periods and their true purpose. I wrote about the necessity of darkness and Varanus's philosophy. I wrote about Velen's tears and her shaking hands and her admission of slow death inside. I wrote about my choice, because here is what I understood in those final hours. Varanus might be right. The Imperium might genuinely need to commit these horrors to survive. The calculus of necessity might be mathematically sound, but accepting that logic, living by that rationalization, implementing those policies required destroying the part of a person that recognized other humans as equally real and valuable. It required transforming people into categories, productive and unproductive, necessary and expendable, loyal and suspect. It required killing empathy slowly, starving conscience deliberately, choosing duty over humanity every single day until nothing human remained except the physical form. Velen was not wrong when she said she was dying inside. She was dying. Everyone who adapted to this system was dying. They were becoming the mechanical components they needed their subordinates to be. They were transforming themselves into the very machinery of oppression. And perhaps the Imperium needed that machinery. Perhaps humanity genuinely could not survive without people willing to make themselves into monsters. But I would not be one of them. I finished writing as the first bell of morning rang. I made 3 copies of my account on data, slates, encrypted them with codes only determined investigation could crack, and concealed them in different locations throughout my habitation. Then I gathered my documentation from the vault, returned to the archive one last time, and went to Velen's office. She looked older than she had the day before. Her human eye had dark circles beneath it. Her hands shook visibly as she reached for her morning recaf. "You have made your decision," she said. "Not a question." "I have."
"You will not adapt, I cannot."
She nodded slowly, set down her recaf, activated her Vox link. "Security. This is Archivist Primaris Velen. I have a Code 17 situation in my office. Single subject, non-violent, full cooperation expected. Discretion authorized." She closed the Vox link, looked at me with her exhausted human eye. "They will be here in approximately 4 minutes. You will be taken to Level 3, where you will be processed according to inquisitorial security protocols. The process is not pleasant, but it is generally quick. Your memory will be wiped if the Inquisitor judges you salvageable, or you will be executed if not. Your personnel file will note that you suffered psychological breakdown due to exposure to disturbing documentation, which is technically accurate. You will be mourned appropriately at the next chapel service. Someone will speak well of your 16 years of dedicated service. Will you speak?" "Yes," she said quietly. "I will speak of how faithfully you served, how precisely you worked, how much your dedication meant to the sacred duty of maintaining the Emperor's records." Her voice broke slightly. "I will not mention that you were braver than I am. I will not mention that you chose conscience over survival. I will not mention that you made me remember what it felt like to believe that some things matter more than continuing to breathe. Thank you. Do not thank me. I am condemning you to death or worse. You are allowing me to die as myself rather than living as something I am not. That is a gift." She stood, moved around her desk, and did something I had never seen her do. In 16 years she embraced me. Her body shook with suppressed weeping. "I am sorry," she whispered against my shoulder. "I am so terribly sorry. You deserved better than this. You deserved to serve an Imperium worthy of your faith." Perhaps we all did. The security team arrived precisely 4 minutes after her Vox call, as she had predicted. 2 arbitrators in full carapace armor, shock mauls at their belts, expressions professionally blank. They were polite as they secured my hands. Gentle, even, as if they knew I had committed no crime except possessing a conscience. Velen watched as they led me from her office. The last thing I saw before they took me from the archive was her human eye, streaming tears, and her augmetic eye, recording everything with mechanical precision. Both witnesses to what I was and what I was choosing to become. They took me to Level 3, as she had said they would. The interrogation cells there were clean, well lit, equipped with the latest memory extraction and modification technology. The interrogator who processed me was young, professional, completely certain of his purpose. He explained the procedure calmly. I would undergo memory scanning to determine what I knew, neural modification to remove dangerous knowledge while preserving basic function, psychological adjustment to eliminate the conscience defect that had led to my breakdown. You will wake in a medica facility, he explained. You will remember your name and basic life information, but your time in the archive will be hazy, distant, emotionally neutral. You will be assigned to new duties appropriate to your reduced capability. You will live a peaceful life, unburdened by the knowledge that troubled you. This is mercy, truly. We restore you rather than simply ending you. I do not want mercy, I told him. I want to remember. I want to die knowing what I know. He looked genuinely puzzled. Why would you choose that? Knowledge without power to act is simply suffering. We offer you peace. We offer you the gift of forgetting. Why refuse? Because forgetting would be lying, I said. It would be pretending that what I discovered was not real. It would be choosing comfortable fiction over uncomfortable truth. I will not do that. If my options are living with memory erased or dying with memory intact, I choose death. The interrogator made a notation on his data slate. That complicates matters. Memory modification requires subject cooperation for optimal results. Forced modification produces unreliable outcomes. Possible permanent neural damage, high probability of vegetative state. Given your lack of cooperation, execution becomes more efficient option. He looked up from his slate. Are you certain? This is your final opportunity to choose continued existence. I am certain. He nodded, made another notation, left the cell. 20 minutes later, an inquisitor arrived. Not Valdane, who had destroyed Malfi, but someone I did not recognize. She was old, perhaps 3 centuries given her rejuvenate treatments, and she carried the same exhaustion in her eyes that I had seen in Velen's. Matthias Kael, she said, reviewing the data slate the interrogator had given her. 16 years of exemplary service. No prior disciplinary issues. Strong faith indicators. Standard psychological profile until approximately 2 months ago, when you began demonstrating signs of moral crisis. She set down the slate. The interrogator tells me you refuse memory modification and accept execution as alternative. This is unusual. Most who discover what you have discovered choose the mercy of forgetting. Why do you choose differently? Because I want at least one person to remember that Malfi's 73 million citizens existed. That they were innocent. That they were murdered anyway. If I forget, if my memory is erased, then no one carries witness to their deaths. They become pure statistics, numbers in a ledger with no one to grieve them, no one to say their deaths mattered. The Inquisitor studied me for a long moment. Your grief will not save them. Your memory will not resurrect them. Your death will not reform the Imperium. What purpose does your witness serve except making you suffer? It serves the purpose of being true, I said. It serves the purpose of refusing to pretend that necessary evil is not evil. It serves the purpose of maintaining that some things are wrong even when they are required. Even if the Imperium genuinely needs these horrors to survive, even if Varanus was completely correct about the calculus of necessity, I will not accept that murdering innocence is good. I will only accept that it is evil we have chosen to commit. That distinction matters. That truth matters. She was silent for nearly a minute, her face unreadable. Then she said something that surprised me. I agree with you. Then why do you serve? Because someone must make these choices, and I would rather they be made by people who understand what we are doing than by people who convince themselves that cruelty is kindness. I do not believe the Imperium is good. I believe it is necessary. Those are not the same thing, and conflating them produces worse horrors than acknowledging the distinction. She picked up the data, slate again. You could serve in this capacity. You could become one of the people who makes these choices while maintaining full knowledge of their cost. Your crisis of conscience demonstrates the precise quality we need. You care about individual human lives even when strategic calculus requires sacrificing them. That caring, properly directed, produces better decisions than either mindless cruelty or naive mercy. You are offering me Velen's choice. I am offering you the opportunity to prevent some deaths, rather than preventing none, to shape how these cullings occur, rather than simply refusing all participation. You cannot save Malfi's 73 million. They are already dead. But you could influence whether the next Malfi dies quickly by orbital bombardment or slowly by starvation. You could ensure that economic purges target the smallest populations possible rather than being implemented carelessly. You could reduce the horror even if you cannot eliminate it. She leaned forward. Or you can die here, accomplished nothing except preserving your own sense of moral purity. Which choice actually reduces suffering, Matthias? It was a good argument, a compelling argument. For a moment, I almost accepted it. But then I understood what she was doing. She was offering me rationalization. She was offering me the same logic Velen had accepted, the same philosophy Varinus had articulated, the same slow death of conscience disguised as pragmatic adaptation. She was offering me the opportunity to become what I had refused to become. No, I said. You are right that my death accomplishes nothing. You are right that I could reduce some suffering by participating in the system. But I would do so at the cost of accepting the system's fundamental premise, that human lives can be sorted into categories of valuable and expendable, that some people matter more than others, that it is acceptable to murder innocents when the calculation justifies it. Once I accept that premise, once I begin thinking in those terms, I become part of the machinery of oppression. I become another Velen, faithfully serving while slowly dying inside. I become another you, rationalizing horror as harm reduction. I will not do it. Then you choose to die for nothing. I choose to die refusing to become something worse than dead. The Inquisitor stood, gathered her data slate. Your execution will be performed within the hour. Pray to the Emperor if you wish. I will ensure the process is quick. She paused at the cell door. For what it is worth, I respect your choice even as I consider it wasteful. The Imperium needs more people like you. It also requires that people like you either adapt or be eliminated. That paradox is perhaps the clearest proof that we are not the glorious civilization we claim to be. She left. I sat alone in the cell. And I did pray. Not to ask for salvation, not to beg for rescue. I prayed gratitude for clarity. I prayed that whoever might find my hidden documentation would understand what I had tried to preserve. I prayed for Velen, who would continue serving while dying inside. I prayed for the Inquisitor, who understood the horror of what she did and did it anyway. I prayed for all the people throughout the Imperium's vast bureaucracy, who maintained the machinery of systematic murder while maintaining just enough conscience to recognize what they were doing. And I prayed for Malfi's 73 million dead. I spoke their number aloud in that cell, gave voice to the statistic, tried to imagine each one as a person with thoughts and hopes and loves. I could not imagine them all. 73 million was beyond my capacity to visualize. But I tried. It was the last thing I could do for them. The executioner came precisely 1 hour after the Inquisitor's departure. He was not cruel. He was not theatrical. He was professional, efficient, almost gentle as he prepared the neural disruptor. "Do you have final words you wish recorded?" he asked.
Yes,
I said. "Document that Matthias Kael, Senior Ledger, Keeper 3rd Class, refused to accept that murdering innocents was necessary. Document that he chose death over complicity. Document that he tried, however futilely, to bear witness to the truth of what the Imperium does in the name of survival. Document that at least one person in the vast machinery of imperial governance saw the horror clearly and refused to pretend it was anything other than what it was." He made notations on his data slate, documented. "Anything else? Tell Archivist, Primaris Velen, that I do not judge her. Tell her that I understand why she made her choice. Tell her that I hope she finds peace, even though I could not find it in her solution. I will convey your message." He activated the neural disruptor, positioned it against the base of my skull. "The Emperor protects." "The Emperor," I said, silent. I am dead now. I have been dead for 3 hours, though time becomes strange when you exist only as electrical patterns in a cogitator's memory banks. The executioner was efficient. The neural disruptor worked precisely as designed. My body stopped functioning, but in the final moment before total cessation, the interrogation equipment captured my consciousness, preserved it, stored it for review and analysis. Standard inquisitorial procedure when executing someone with sensitive knowledge. Capture their consciousness in case further information needs to be extracted. They have not yet discovered that I used those final moments to encode this testimony into my preserved consciousness, that I structured my final thoughts as a narrative that could be reconstructed from the neural data. They will find it eventually. They will delete it eventually. But first, someone will read it. Someone will know. If you are reading this, then you are that someone. You have accessed the neural preservation files from Inquisitorial Holding, Sub, Level 3, Tricorn Palace, Scintilla. You have reconstructed the consciousness fragments into coherent narrative. You know what I discovered. You know what I chose. I do not know who you are. I do not know when you are reading this, whether it is days or decades or centuries after my death. I do not know if you are Inquisition, Administratum, Arbites, or some other branch of imperial service. I do not know if you are looking for evidence of heresy or searching for truth or simply doing routine data archaeology in old files. But I know you face a choice now, just as I faced it. You can delete this file and forget what you have read. You can rationalize that the Imperium's survival requires these horrors, that Varanus was right about the necessity of darkness. That adaptation is the only realistic response. You can become like Velen, faithfully serving while dying inside. You can become like the Inquisitor who offered me rationalization disguised as harm reduction. You can join the vast machinery of systematic murder and tell yourself that you are reducing suffering even as you facilitate it. Or you can refuse. You can choose conscience over survival. You can die knowing rather than live forgetting. You can preserve this testimony and pass it forward, bearing witness to the truth of what the Imperium does and what it is. I do not presume to tell you which choice is correct. I only know which choice I made and why I made it. The Imperium may need its dark foundations. Varanus may be right about the calculus of necessity. The survival of humanity may genuinely require systematic murder of innocents, regular cullings disguised as anti-heresy operations, economic purges rationalized through fabricated charges. I am not wise enough to know whether the alternative would be better or worse. But I am certain of this: if these horrors are necessary, they are still horrors. If cruelty serves survival, it is still cruelty. If murdering innocents prevents greater catastrophe, those innocents are still murdered. The ends may justify the means, but the means remain what they are. Evil in service of necessity is still evil, even if it is also necessary. That distinction matters. That truth matters. Because the moment we stop recognizing horror as horror, the moment we convince ourselves that necessary evil is not evil, we lose the capacity to judge where necessity ends and gratuitous cruelty begins. We lose the ability to question whether the supposed necessity is genuine or merely convenient. We lose ourselves in the rationalization, and we become the very thing we claim to be preventing. Velen knew this. The Inquisitor knew this. Everyone who rises high enough in the Imperium's hierarchy to see the truth knows this. And most of them make the choice to continue serving anyway, to adapt and survive and rationalize and slowly die inside while maintaining the machinery of systematic murder. I could not make that choice. Perhaps that makes me weak. Perhaps that makes me impractical. Perhaps that makes me a fool who threw away his life for moral purity that accomplishes nothing. But I would rather be a dead fool with clear conscience than a living pragmatist who maintains his existence by transforming himself into a component of the horror he claims to oppose. You who are reading this, you who have reconstructed my consciousness from the neural preservation files, you now carry the same knowledge that killed me. The Imperium is not corrupted. The Imperium is functioning as designed. The horrors are not aberrations. The horrors are policy. The deaths are not accidents. The deaths are calculated. Malfi's 73 million citizens died not because they were heretics, but because supporting them was economically inefficient. The correction periods happen every 3 years not because heresy outbreaks follow predictable cycles, but because population culling serves administrative convenience and maintains fear. This is what we are. This is what the Imperium does in the name of humanity's survival. This is the truth that 16 years of faithful service taught me. And now you must choose what to do with that truth. Will you delete this file and forget? Will you preserve it and pass it forward? Will you adapt to the horror? Will you refuse to participate? Will you try to reform the system from within? Will you accept that reform is impossible and choose quiet resistance? Will you rationalize that survival justifies anything? Will you insist that some lines cannot be crossed regardless of consequence? I do not know which choice is right. I only know that I chose to die remembering rather than live forgetting. I chose to bear witness, even when witness accomplished nothing. I chose to say that Malfi's 73 million citizens mattered, that their innocence mattered, that their deaths were murder regardless of how many strategic calculations justified them. Perhaps that choice was selfish. Perhaps it was cowardice disguised as courage. Perhaps it was prideful refusal to compromise, rather than practical adaptation to reality. Perhaps I should have accepted the Inquisitor's offer, joined the system, tried to reduce harm from within rather than accomplishing nothing through my refusal. But I am dead now, and I am still myself. My conscience is intact. My memory is preserved. My testimony exists. And somewhere in the vast machinery of the Imperium, at least one data file contains the truth about what we are and what we do. That is something. It is not much. It does not save Malfi. It does not prevent the next correction period. It does not reform the Imperium or redeem its victims or make the horror less horrible. But it is true, and it exists, and now you know it. What will you do with that knowledge? The choice is yours now, just as it was mine. Choose carefully. Choose honestly. Choose knowing that both options carry cost. And if you choose as I chose, if you choose conscience over survival, then before they come for you, encode your own testimony. Preserve your own witness. Pass the truth forward so that someone in the Imperium's future might know that we were not all monsters. That some of us saw the horror clearly and refused to accept it as necessary. That resistance existed even if it accomplished nothing except preserving the memory that resistance is possible. My name was Matthias Kael. I served as Senior Ledger Keeper, 3rd Class, in the Ordo Hereticus Archive Subsection on Scintilla for 16 years. I processed 17,643 execution records. I believed I was serving justice. I discovered I was documenting murder. I chose to die rather than continue participating in systematic evil. I am dead now. I have been dead for 3 hours, or perhaps 3 days, or perhaps 3 centuries, depending on when you are reading this. Time has no meaning for preserved consciousness waiting in dormant files. But I am not forgotten yet. You remember me now. You carry my testimony. You know what I knew, and that means Malfi's 73 million citizens are not forgotten either. Somewhere in the vast machinery of imperial bureaucracy, in a neural preservation file accessed by someone searching old interrogation records, Their deaths are remembered as murder, rather than necessary justice. Their innocence is documented. Their truth is preserved. It is not much, but it is something. It is what I could do with the choice I was given. Now the choice passes to you. Bear witness or forget. Resist or adapt. Die yourself or live as something else. Whatever you choose, choose knowing what the choice means. Choose honestly. Choose with open eyes. And if you can, if you have the strength, choose truth over convenience. Choose conscience over survival. Choose to remember rather than forget. Because if even one person in each generation refuses to accept that horror is necessity, if even one person insists that some things remain wrong regardless of strategic calculation, if even one person bears witness to the truth of what we are, then perhaps the Imperium is not entirely beyond redemption. Perhaps. I do not know. I am dead, and the dead do not know the future. But I know this: I died as Matthias Kael, Senior Ledger Keeper, 3rd Class. Faithful servant of the Emperor, until I learned what faithful service required. I died refusing to become what the system demanded. I died myself. That is something. It may be the only thing that matters. My name is Matthias Kael. I processed 17,643 execution records. I discovered that most of them were murder. I chose death over complicity. This is my testimony. Remember it or delete it. The choice is yours. But if you remember, if you preserve this testimony and pass it forward, then know that you carry not just my witness, but the witness of everyone I tried to honor through my refusal. Malfi's 73 million dead, Sanofia's 8,000 murdered workers. The 4,712 souls killed during the last correction period, and all the countless millions whose deaths I documented without understanding what their deaths truly were. They were innocent. They were murdered. Their deaths mattered. Someone must remember that truth, even if remembering accomplishes nothing except preserving the truth itself. I chose to be that someone. Now I am dead, and the choice passes to you. Choose well. Choose honestly. Choose knowing what you choose. The Emperor protects those who serve him faithfully. But I learned that faithful service requires becoming something I could not bear to be. So I chose to die, and I died as myself, and that is my testimony complete. Witness and remember, or delete and forget. The machinery of the Imperium continues regardless. But at least now you know what the machinery does, and what it costs to refuse participation. At least now you know the truth. What you do with that truth is your choice alone. Make it wisely. Make it honestly. Make it yours.